Okay, so just a little bit of context for today then. So this is the very start of my PhD journey. So it really has all come about through working on the MA course. So for those of you that don't know, I head up an MA in professional practice invoice pedagogy, and I help with students in the management of their projects. And part of what they have to do is to create a methodological approach to whatever it is they're doing, whether that's research or whether it is even just undertaking a literature review. And what I noticed was when they went off to do the research, they were under tremendous strain, because not only were they having to build subject specialist knowledge, which is incredibly intense in its own right. And I think in voice, it's extremely intense because you're crossing over multidisciplinary boundaries. So the students were often being swallowed up into various rabbit holes, but at the same time, they're being pressed to actually come up with a methodology. And when I started to look at methodology myself, my goodness, I mean, it's a discipline in itself. It's enormous, it's absolutely vast. And so I found that they were coming up against brick walls over and over again, in that the terminology wasn't very accessible. And, you know, it's taken me maybe 3 or 4 months to get to the place now where I can just put this lecture on and just disentangling all of the different terminology. And so really that sparked the journey for my PhD, because ultimately what I want to do is to create accessible frameworks that students from voice, which is essentially multidisciplinary, can align themselves more appropriately with the methodology that suits their position. And it isn't just a case that we're all artistic practitioners or that we're all scientific practitioners. You know, we cross over those boundaries. So I think as a discipline, we're quite complex. And so today is essentially it's my first outing of this material. So I've written a paper that is a little bit in a shabby state at the moment, and I'm hoping to make everything free and very accessible for those of you who are on a journey. I have collated a series of resources that go with today, but I keep tinkering with them, but I'm happy to share those too. So I'm just going to share my screen with you. I'll take my slideshow. Can you see that okay? I'm just going to change my setting over. It should work. So is that okay? Can everybody see that? I'm just going to. So is that a thumbs up, Sammy? Up to you can see that. Okay, great. Sometimes when I do this, the first slide doesn't actually move. So the aim of the session today then is to actually assess the importance of the literature review process. And I'm going to take you through a range of methodologies so that you can think about what suits you as a practitioner researcher. We're going to look to some degree, although I don't want to go too deep, delve too deep into sort of ontology and areas such as that, for those of you that are not familiar with that terminology, but we're going to look at the implications of us being multidisciplinary practitioners. And hopefully, when you finish today, you'll at least understand the different types of review, and you'll be able to choose and maybe align yourself with one type or many types even. So then what's the importance of the literature review? Well, Boot and Beale make it quite clear that it's regarded as a primer for methodological and theoretical sophistication. And I like that idea. So I chose this quote because it's very much an idea that it prepares, sets you up for that sophistication. And a study was carried out by Mullins and Kiles in 2002. And what this study did was it researched postgraduate and doctoral research papers. And what they found was the literature review was incredibly important because it formed the very first impression. And that first impression was extremely persuasive. So when the examiners were examining either postgraduate work or doctoral work, they were very much swayed by that literature review. And it was then they kind of decided in their minds that this is a really good indicator just how well the students actually grasp the complexity of the problem. And it sort of set up, what they found was it set up the rest of their judgment. And once they'd made their mind up because of a poor review, then that negatively impacted their perception of the rest of the research work, even if it improved markedly. So that goes to show just how important the literature review process is. Onward Gabuzi, and I apologise if I don't pronounce that correctly, and Daniel examined 52 manuscripts in an education peer-reviewed journal, and they found that up to 40% had very weak literature reviews. And because of that, they were 6 times more likely to have their manuscripts rejected. So it is very much about setting up a rigorous approach. So, and I think it's important to acknowledge that literature reviews are legitimate and publishable scholarly documents. So they're almost standalone document of value in their own right. They're not just attached to a dissertation, but they're actually capable of being published in their own right. So what does that mean for us then? So we know that they're important, and how do we improve them? And so when we start to embark, well, okay, I'll take a methodological approach to the literature review process. It's not as easy as it seems, because when you start to research it, you'll find yourself in a quagmire of different types of review, and then you're trying to work out, well, what type of review am I actually doing? So I'm going to take you through different types. So we've got narrative. I'm going to summarize them now, and then we're going to work our way through them one by one. So we've got a narrative literature review, systematic literature review with a meta-analysis, systematic literature review with a meta-summary or a metasynthesis. And this is where it starts to get thorny, because suddenly when you decide to go and have a look at different methodologies, you're smashed over the head with these very similar but subtly different terminologies. And so we're going to unpick those terminologies today. So systematic literature review of a qualitative kind, which is also referred to as a qualitative evidence synthesis or a qualitative metasynthesis, scoping review, and an integrative literature review or a mixed methodology review. So that's the problem, is you start to go into the literature and suddenly, oh my word, this is just a world within a world. So let's unpick some of it now. So I'm going to just walk you through what a narrative literature review is. Now, if you are new to academia, odds on you're going to do a narrative literature review, and there's nothing wrong with a narrative literature review. Essentially, what makes it a narrative literature review is because it is just a narrative. It's your own narrative. So it isn't governed by any particular methodology. And with that comes some really good things, and with it can come some quite negative things. And we'll look at some of those in a moment. So there are essentially no rules. So with a narrative review, we've got no rules. Now, I did do a very brief sweep of the voice and speech review. I went over about 2 years worth of literature reviews, and I found none of them contained a methodology. Now, that's not a criticism. There's no value judgment attached to that whatsoever. So the ones that you'll find in the voice and speech review are predominantly narrative reviews. Now, if you go over to the Journal of Voice, you'll find something very different. You're more likely to come across a systematic literature review. And I think the attraction to the narrative review is the lack of rules. For those who are creative and want to explore ideas without being hemmed in, then a narrative review is a really good place to start, because it gets you writing, gets you cohesing your ideas together and organizing them without being bound by too much methodology. And the thing with methodology is it can be quite frightening in a way, and it can be almost suffocating, particularly the stricter that methodology gets. So they're an excellent way for new writers to develop, and most likely you will do a narrative review if you're undertaking an MA or a PhD. Okay, so What is it then? They're ruleless, but there are quite a few good informational articles about how to maybe introduce some methodology so that you get the best out of it. Now, I've read an awful lot of these articles over the weeks, and I absolutely love the work of Harris Cooper. And he talks about a taxonomy of literature reviews. Now, I think this is absolutely fabulous for getting you to really unpick what you're doing. I think it is excellent for good academic writing. So I've decided to give it some coverage here. Now, what Harris Cooper suggests, he basically draws up a taxonomy of literature reviews and he comes up with a template. Now, a template can actually be a nice thing to work with because it can anchor you. So it's great having creative freedom. When you've got too much creative freedom, it can be quite scary and also unstructured, and you can lose your way. So what this does, I think, can give you a little bit of clarity to work from because it asks the right questions. I'm just letting some people into my session a bit late. So be clear on your focus, and I think it's a good idea in your introduction to think about what it is you're including and actually make explicit to the reader what it is you intend to include. So in your literature review, you may focus on the research outcomes, you may focus on the research methods, you might be looking at the theories, you might be much more concerned with practice and application. So in your introduction, state quite clearly what your focus is likely to be. Now, you may wish to combine some of those. You don't have to stick to one. But in his taxonomy, he highlights these sort of 4 key areas. So that's the first thing. Identify your focus and decide what it is you're going to look at and tell us and think about it. Then think about what your overall goal is. Is it integration? Are you seeking to integrate literature and draw conclusions or draw generalizations? In other words, does the literature show over and over and over again, perhaps say for argument's sake, that MPA has typical symptoms, and we've got 25 studies that all say the same thing. Maybe we can start to make generalizations. So is that what it is you're seeking to do? Maybe you're drawing together a very complex, multidisciplinary area, which will involve you engaging in some kind of conflict resolution. Or you may be cross-extrapolating from different disciplines, and therefore you're linguistically bridge building. You're creating a linguistic theoretical framework that's sympathetic to the discipline that you're in. And I think, and I'm sure a lot of you on here will be agreeing with me, thinking that this is a real issue in voice, that often we're drawing from other disciplines. Just take acoustics. How unsympathetic is acoustic language to the voice? And a lot of the terminology in laryngology is quite hostile to us as practitioners when we're working with voice and with voice users. So sometimes we're linguistically bridge building in our reviews. Perhaps we're engaging in some kind of criticism. Maybe we're setting out determined to engage in some kind of critique. I mean, you can do all of these together, very ambitious to do so, but your goal might be to identify the very core and central issues. So all of these factors can help align where you're going to take your literature review. What's your perspective? Now, this is a really important one. And what I notice with students is because suddenly you're bound by these academic rules, you're bound by having to reference, it can almost stunt your own voice. And I completely understand how that happens. And so it's worth thinking to yourself, what kind of position are you going to take? Now, usually new writers will often adopt a neutral position because they feel it's safer to do so. And they will explore maybe the fors and against and try and present an unbiased position. And it's absolutely fine to do that. And it's also fine at the end of it to conclude and make your position clear, or as you go through even to make your position clear. Other writers will write from what's known as an espousal position, in which case they will make very clear their bias. So it's sometimes in research we call it positionality. You reveal your position and you're proud of your position, but you make it so transparent that your bias is clear. Now, the advantage of doing that is if you're actually theoretically building or you're trying to argue a position, you're likely to argue it with much more sort of weight and maybe draw more interesting theoretical conclusions if you come from the espousal position. What are you going to cover? Are you going to be exhaustive? Possibly not. That's quite a challenge to be exhaustive. They've just started drilling. I hope nobody can hear it too bad. I live in the middle of the country. Why are they drilling in the middle of the country while I'm doing this? It's just how it is, isn't it? Joys of home working. So are you going to be exhaustive? Are you going to be exhaustive but accept that you can't include everything? In which case you're going to do something called selective citation. So you're going to say that you've done an exhaustive search, but you are actually choosing to select particular studies over and above others. Or you may take a representative sample, or you may just select out on the basis of the studies being central or pivotal. So that's a really good way of having an inclusion-exclusion criteria, is by identifying those central and pivotal arguments. I've got something in the chat. Fracking. What, is it really noisy? I can shut my door if it is. I've got a door, so I'll just shut my door. Right, that's better. So you may wish to identify those arguments that are central and pivotal, and make sure that when you do use selective citation, you make it quite clear why you're selecting out those studies over and above others. And how are you going to organise it? You can organise it historically. So it might be that you wish to take a timeline. There might be a reason why there's a very important incremental development that you need to capture. And so you take a historical approach in the way that you build your study. It can be quite enlightening for the reader to know how a discipline's evolved. You may wish to order it in terms of concepts. So what are the key themes? What are the key concepts within the field? Historical, conceptual, or methodological is our third one. So you may wish to order it in terms of methodology, and you may wish to have a heavy critique of the methodologies used. So it just depends on how you want to slant it. So what I love about Cooper's work is I do think it just asks you these really helpful core questions that are useful for whatever you're writing. Who are you writing for? Now, this is a bit of a moot point, really, I've found in the literature in terms of who you should be writing for. Some people say that you should be writing for an intelligent reader, and always you should give your, whatever it is you're writing, to somebody that's intelligent and not necessarily involved in your specialism, to see if they can understand it. Whereas Cooper suggests that it's okay to write for particular types of scholars. So it's a bit of an open point, that one. Okay, so that's the narrative review. It's very little rules involved. I like Cooper's work because it gives us some template and tells us how to do it, with some guidance without necessarily tying our hands too much. But it's possible to treat the narrative, it's possible to treat the literature review as a form of data in itself. And then we're into a whole different ballgame. We move into other types of literature review. We move out of the narrative into something that perhaps is methodologically more sophisticated. And there are some writers that have slammed the narrative review. So there are a lot of researchers out there who are very anti the narrative review because of its lack of discipline, because of its lack of rules. And they say that literature should always be treated as data. And if you treat it as data, then you need to subject it to a methodology. And this is where it gets much more trickier. And what some of them argue, so Omar-Gabuzi, Leach and Collins say that actually once you do that, you will improve significantly your chances of publication. So I just want to now look, moving into more of the systematic review, I want to look at this evolution of evidence-based practice because it's actually fascinating and it's very interesting how it's all evolved. So the narrative review has really been hammered, so it's been slated. And it's kind of the existence of that narrative review that's led to the evolution of evidence-based practice. Now, this at the moment, particularly in singing pedagogy, is so current, and we're hearing the term evidence-based vocal pedagogy quite a lot. So I thought it'd be really interesting to have a look at other disciplines to see where it's rooted, where's this come from, how have they dealt with it, and can it help us as voice practitioners? And the answer is yes, I do think it can. So although it's a new concept, perhaps in voice pedagogy, and I know that Carrie Reagan's stuff which was recently written deals with this issue of what is evidence-based voice pedagogy. But it's not new to other disciplines, and it very first reared its head back in 1971 when Archie Cochrane savagely critiqued the healthcare intervention system for being based on poor evidential rigor. So Archie Cochrane, so if you've heard of the Cochrane Review, it comes from the work of Archie Cochrane. So back in 1971, we started to shift our thinking on literature, which actually isn't that long ago, really, in terms of this whole idea of literature as data is quite a new concept. And it started with Archie Cochrane really critiquing in the review system. Glass in 1976 referred to narrative reviews as casual narrative discussions of research studies. So it's quite sort of condemning. So the problem that was arising that was as we were getting more and more as these primary research studies were evolving, reviewers were just overwhelmed with them. So then what happened is that they produced reports that were unsound, subjective and biased. We have now subsequently, since Cochrane, improved how we file all of our research reports. They're much easier to get hold of now, but initially they weren't. So what was happening was that these reports were sort of brought together, but weren't necessarily done so in a very well-researched manner, which was leading to very subjective and biased accounts. This came to a head historically in 1992 in the Atman et al. Study, which was savagely critical of something that was very, very serious. So basically, a whole number of informal reviews led to the prescription of the wrong treatment for myocardial infarction, which I have since looked up and means a heart attack. So the basis of the policy was originally formed on these narrative reviews that were poorly researched, that were evidentially unsound. And so Antman was a pivotal moment where it was, we can't do this. We cannot do this in our healthcare sector, have things that are so unsoundly based on poor evidential rigor. And so with that, we've then had the rise of the evidence-based practice movement. And what we've got is a series of bodies that have been established that look in, day out, how we create best practice and how we collate research to evidence that best practice. And so we've got this sort of real methodological innovation that's gone on, that's been brought about by Cochrane. So the Cochrane Collaboration, you can look up online. There's an absolute team of resources available in there. It's incredible what they've done. And this has given rise to the randomized controlled trial. So health was the first kind of influx, the first kind of pivotal changing moment, I suppose. It came in from the health studies. It's then filtered into social welfare, it's filtered into education. We've got the EPPI Centre, another body that you can tap into, full of resources, full of great resources. The Campbell Consortium for Social Science Intervention, again, brilliantly resourced. So all of these came around in the 90s. So this was the real shift where we started to say, no, we don't treat narrative data as a lovely just a lovely journey. We actually systemize it and we treat it as proper evidence. And so it's a huge movement. And I think now we're seeing that in voice pedagogy. And I'm wondering whether, because vocal health is so pivotal in voice, that this has led us to reach for these disciplines quite naturally as an emerging discipline, which is what we are. We're starting to reach into other disciplines. And I think this is the influx that's coming in, quite importantly, because of the need to protect our vocal health. So that's kind of its historical journey, which I found quite fascinating when I read about it. I hope I haven't bored you too much. But the purpose of these consortiums is that they have strategically thought out how we produce these high quality, standalone, gold standard systematic reviews. And they've done it through a process called meta-analysis. Now, meta-analysis is essentially an aggregate statistic. So it's where homogeneous studies, so studies that are methodologically similar, are collated together and they're given a kind of aggregate statistic in terms of the significance. They're quite complicated to do. Please don't feel pressure to do one if you're a student. Don't panic. No need to panic at this point. But what they are useful for is learning how to systemize. So it's kind of like taking a step away from the narrative review. You might find it attractive. Some of the resources that they have on offer, you might find them attractive. So what's a systematic review? Just to give you a quick definition, keep moving myself down the screen. They seek to collate evidence that fits pre-specified eligibility criteria in order to answer a specific research question. They aim to minimize bias by using explicit, systematic methods documented in advance with a protocol. Okay, so with these systematic reviews, there are teams of researchers. They work together as specialists. They register them in a pre-registered process. So they're all registered on a particular system so that we can index them, we can track them, we can research them as researchers ourselves much more easily. And they work to a particular protocol. So they're the antithesis of the narrative review because they're working to a very strict and rigid protocol. I've taken this definition from the Cochrane Handbook. The Cochrane Handbook is accessible online and talks you step by step through how to do one. They are also recorded using the PRISMA statement. So the PRISMA is preferred reporting items for systematic reviews and meta-analysis. So all of these systematic reviews are governed by something called the PRISMA statement. The PRISMA statement basically gives you like this real heavy duty structure on how to do a systematic review. And I'm going to just bring it up now. Hopefully this should work. And you should be able to see it. Samyukta, can you see that? No. Oh, why is Zoom so rubbish? I'll have to reshare it. Hang on a tick. I knew that was rubbish. There we go. So here it is. I'm not going to go through it bit by bit, but it just shows. I'm just going to make it a bit bigger. Can you see that now? Yes. So it basically takes you through this really detailed structure. Now, some of you might be seeing this structure and getting really excited and thinking, I think I can like this structure. I love structure. Give me a template. This fills me with horror and makes me want to run to the hills. So it's horses for courses. It really is. So what's brilliant is it literally gives you a step-by-step guide on how to do it. Now, you don't need to take it literally to its nth degree, but you can be influenced by some of it. And it helps you build in rigor. So even if you're not going to follow it to the letter, so you probably won't be able to, unlikely be able to do a meta-analysis, but you never know. It's very unlikely that you would do that, but you might take elements of it, which is why I'm sort of raising it today. So I'm going to stop the share and reshare my slide. There we go. Is that visible now? Yeah, okay. It doesn't want to work now. There we go. So the thing with systematic reviews, they can form part of your dissertation. And what's quite nice, if you take some of the ideas, so when you're writing a dissertation, it's what we're looking for is congruence of ideas. So even if you don't literally take every aspect of systematic review, it's nice if you can have some of it, because it might well feed into a quantitative study that you've undertaken. So what we can see is quantitative elements in your study, in your literature review, which then we can see echoed in your study. So it's about building up these methodologies bit by bit and not being frightened to play around with them. Meta-analysis. So meta-analysis is a particular way of coming up with an aggregate statistic. It requires all the studies to be homogeneous. So sometimes in voice, with it being fairly new, it may be that some areas there just wouldn't have enough, there wouldn't be enough homogeneous studies to do a meta-analysis, and it's quite complicated to undertake one. But you can undertake something called a metasynthesis, which I'm going to come back to in a moment. So basically, in its truest form, systematic review is not viable for student researchers. They work in team of experts in its truest form, if you're remaining literal to it, because they're conducted in teams and they're registered and they're within strict timescales. But where it is useful is that you can be influenced by it. So you don't have to take all the elements. Now in voice pedagogy, we're seeing it. We're seeing its influence, and I'll tell you where we're seeing its influence, other than vocal health, is singing for well-being. There are some studies out there. In my compendium of resources, if you want to have a look at one, I put Dakin et al. So this is an excellent example of a systematic review that employs meta-analysis, and the Dakin study, looked at the impact of singing on two aspects, anxiety and depression. And I think it found that it helped depression, but it didn't help anxiety, interestingly. And it did it through a meta-analysis. It's a fascinating study, and it just shows you can see, you could take your Prisma statement, you can cross-examine and look and pull it apart and see how it's been put together if you're interested in using this approach. I'm getting stuck. There. So how's it useful to you as a novice researcher? You don't have to do a systematic review, but you can do a semi-systematic review. So if you have gone down you're going down a quantitative paradigm, maybe you're coming in from a discipline of maybe an SLT, and you're coming in from that discipline, then you've got an MSc, maybe you're going to be wanting to do much more of a semi-systematic approach that's going to link in with the rest of your research, particularly if it's quantitative. The databases are fantastic, so it's worth just messing around with some of these databases. So you've got PubMed, just type in PubMed into Google, it comes up. Medline, same with some of these other ones do as well. Medline, Embase, you've got the Cochrane Library, Web of Science, CNAL, all of these are great databases for you to play around with and research and see what comes up. So even if you don't take on wholesale a systematic approach, there might be some elements that really would boost the quality of the research that you're likely to produce. So that's our systematic review. Now, based on scoping review, a scoping review is kind of an offshoot of a systematic review. Because a scoping review is based on the principles of systematic review, but they're used for new emerging areas. So it'd be really useful for our discipline for some of you to maybe do a scoping review where you're bringing together and synthesizing new areas. Again, it's much more useful where you've got a heterogeneous body of research, which means that you haven't got homogeneous research. You've got research that's quite disparate over maybe different disciplines. Which case a scoping review would be good. Peters et al. Showed you how to do one, as does Munn et al. Both of these are in my compendium of resources that go with this, as is the Prisma statement. So these kind of show you, they just like the Prisma statement I brought up, it gives you that minutiae bullet point, do this, do that, do this, which some of you will like to work with. So why are they important and why are they worth giving more attention to within our discipline is because they influence funding. And I'm really seeing this absolutely with my own eyes as students come off the MA. And the more rigorous they are in singing for health, they've actually been able to get funding because they're regarded as the gold standard. So when you're working in an area involving the NHS, give me the evidence. When you're asking for funding, okay, you've done a study, great, give me the evidence. And so they're wanting to see that evidence, even if you can't replicate a systematic review, if you're being influenced by those processes, they're going to be much more sympathetic to your case. And I'm definitely seeing that in Singing for Health and the Singing for Health network that's just been established by Emily Falk, and also in vocal health as well. So they are important, but you know, they may not be for you. It wouldn't be for me. As much as I value its importance, it's not an area I would ever go down. I can't see me ever doing it. So criticisms of the evidence-based model, well, it's not without its critics. So we kind of, this narrative review, rubbish, 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 bring in the evidence-based practice model. Let's get this rigorous gold standard review style going on, randomized controlled trials. I was reading just how many are even done every day. It's a huge amount are done every day now. So we've just got an enormous amount of these primary source studies coming out. Hammersley is incredibly critical of it and says anybody that raises doubts about it is regarded as either mad or bad. So he's quite anti the evidence-based practice model. I love his work, it's completely outrageous and the opposite, often unreferenced, but theoretically really, really very interesting. And what he says is it's not the only source of evidence and it's not capable of providing all the evidence that we need to make decisions. And he also says often it doesn't give us the information we need to actually put in our practice. Practice is grey, it's difficult to define, it moves, it's, you know, these primary source studies invariably will not relate to the practice issue that we need to solve. So he's very, very critical of it. And he says, actually, what it does is it undermines our professional judgment and our tacit knowledge. And he's released a series of studies. I've got them if you want to read them, where he's really quite anti it. So where do we go from here then? So it might be that you quite like the narrative review, you might be drawn to the systematic review. We've got problems with it. Are there any alternatives? I'm probably just going to shoot through that in a moment. We're only here for an hour. There are alternatives, and what we've seen with Cochrane is it's softened. We've moved out away from, well, not moved away, but we've got another subcategory that's emerged called metasynthesis. So we've got our number crunching on one end, where we get our aggregate statistic. We call that a meta-analysis. And suddenly what happens if we can't give it a statistical significance? What do we do then? We use words. And if we use words, we're into the realm of it becoming a bit more blurry, a bit more movable. And this is called a metasynthesis. And it's kind of a bridging, I think, it's a really good bridge between the quantitative and the qualitative. So if you ontologically sit in the paradigm that is quantitative-ish, so if you veer towards more science, but you're also artistic as well, and you're not comfortable being over too far left field on the arts side, she says, moving her right hand, you might feel more comfortable somewhere in the middle. So it really is a case of doing what fits for you. And this metasynthesis enables you to engage in summaries. So we haven't got that many homogeneous studies in voice. And and possibly doing a meta-analysis would be challenging, and also it would be challenging anyway just to do one. So a meta-synthesis enables you to do more summaries. So in other words, we don't do statistic, we have nice themed description of summaries, but you can keep it quite quantitative if you still do some quantitative calculations. So Diane Kenny, we all know and love her for her work on music performance anxiety. She's a scientist, and she comes from a quantitative paradigm, very much so. And her work on MPA is a really great example of metasynthesis. So she divides it into themes and summaries, but she does undertake some quantitative statistical analysis. It's not a meta-analysis, it's kind of other stuff, but you can keep them quite quancy, but you don't have to. You can then segue into more of a looser qualitative terrain if you wish to. So can you see how we've kind of gone loose, really super tight with a aggregate statistic? We're loosening up a little bit with a meta-synthesis and bringing in words and summaries. It's up to you how tight you keep it, how regimented you keep it, how systemized you keep it. It's completely up to you. So you might want to sit in the quantitative paradigm. You may want to draw on those resources. There is an absolutely mammoth amount of incredible resources on the Cochrane Committee and the Campbell Group, YouTube videos galore, detail on how to do this. How far you go into that rabbit hole is a question that you can decide for yourselves when you have to obviously synthesize all of your other material as well. So my advice to you is to take it slowly. Just flirt with it, play with it, introduce bits of it. It's fine to do a narrative review, but you can introduce other elements into it as you go. So just do it gradually. Don't get swallowed up by it, and don't panic. And so you can end up with this sort of semi-systematic review. And how semi-systematic you are is really your choice. And the meta-synthesis, or a meta-summary as it's sometimes called, is a viable option for you, I think, as new researchers, or established ones, if I have some established ones on here. So this whole concept of metasynthesis, then, it can live in the quantitative terrain, but it can also live in the qualitative terrain. So suddenly, when we get into the more of the qualitative domain, well, I feel infinitely more comfortable. We're into philosophy, we're into theories, we're into concepts, we're into ideas. I live here. I have no intention of going over the other side. But you might not like it here and feel much more comfortable on the other side. And that's the beauty of a multidisciplinary practice. As long as we provide those frameworks, we can have this hotbed of wonderfully flourishing a mix of glorious voice study stuff that in all sorts of paradigms, and that's what we need. So it's sometimes referred to as a qualitative evidence synthesis. And so we can see here we're getting much more into the artistic terrain. It might resonate with you much more. The emphasis is placed on novel interpretations and interpretive transformations. I love those two phrases. Automatically I'd be going, yes, this is where I sit. But again, this notion of a qualitative systematic review is new. This is a new thing. This has only really come about within the last 5 years. We didn't have this previously. So this is a new kind of degree of rigor that's been introduced by the Cochrane Committee. And Booth originally was, who incidentally is now involved in this qualitative systematic review, but originally he was fuming with it and described it as institutional quantitativism. Okay. And one of the things that is argued is that actually we shouldn't be systemizing our qualitative material at all, because what we're trying to do with qualitative research is to capture lots of different realities. And so it's anti-hierarchy. So qualitative research stands at the opposite end of the spectrum in its extreme and is anti-hierarchy. So some of you may feel that even a systematic qualitative review is still an impingement on your artistic license to be creative and to be representative of the diversity of voices, because it's considered to be non-hierarchical and therefore this sort of sensitive. So I'll let you think about those ideas. And if we think about the artistic process, it's supposed to resist abstraction and jargon and blur the lines between researchers and participants, writers and readers, performers and audiences. So that's the artistic process. It resists abstraction, it resists jargon, it resists having clearly marked out lines. So the whole idea of qualitative research is supposed to be subversive. The moment you define it, it moves. So we're constantly moving and we're constantly challenging. And so you may feel that a qualitative systematic review is still too structured for you. And therefore you're going to stick with your nice narrative review where you've got loads of creative freedom. And it's absolutely fine to do whatever you want to do, but just do it with the knowledge that you're doing it, because that in itself will give it more rigor. So as I said, voice researchers may well favour a non-systemised approach, which would take us back to the narrative review. But what I will say is the Cochrane Collaboration have created this explosion of resources that are brilliant. And so you might want to have a bit of a sort of a, just maybe a look, and pick and choose some of them that you like. So the resources are useful, they're thought-provoking, you can pick and mix them to suit your needs. And one of the resources that's created by Booth et al., and I've not put the date on there, it's 2016, is this retreat framework, which I played about with my students with a little bit the other day. And you kind of break down your study before you do it, and you take yourself through these different aspects. And within each section, they've created like loads of templates that you can explore, which I haven't got time to go into today. And it'd probably blow your head off if I did, because you have to sort of build it up slowly. So that's the thing. These methodology is something that you build slowly. So don't be frightened of it, because if you do it slowly, you can use it to liberate you and not imprison you. If you do it too quickly, it'll do the opposite. So it's quite an interesting one, really, just how much we expose students and when to methodology, and I'm unresolved on that. Baits and berry picking, so this is one of their strategies. So when you're searching qualitatively, it's a headache. It's not like searching PubMed. You can use all of those. You may well throw up some interesting studies, all of the databases. But in qualitative research, it's really badly indexed. And so you go to research, as you all know, and it's a nightmare. Bates calls it berry picking, which I really like, because she describes it as, you know, when you're going blackberry picking and you get a bush and you have like 5, and then you get 3 bushes with nothing on, and you've walked half a mile maybe, and before you come across another batch. That's what she says that searching for qualitative research is all about, berry picking. Be prepared to have dry patches. And so she recommends, so it's written in 1989, so it's a little bit out of date now, but some of it's still very relevant. She recommends that you do backward chaining. So you take the most recent study, you go to the footnotes, you go to the references, and then you find all of the references within that study, and then you go and search them. So you're working backwards. It's where it falls down is where you've got quite an old study and suddenly nothing. The other thing to do is citation searching. So one of the things same with literature review, for me, when I was researching literature reviews, it was a nightmare because I was obviously getting up loads of literature reviews. What I wanted to know was how to search literature reviews. So I ended up putting in on Gabuzzi and Daniels, because he seems to have written a lot. So I stuck that in my search engine, and boom, anybody that had quoted that study came up. So that takes you into different areas. It's a really useful strategy. The other thing to do, of course, is the good old-fashioned journal run. You might want to do that with VASTA, the VSR. You would have to literally go through, search through every single one. They do have quite good search engines, as does NATS. The other thing you can do is area scan. So when you search it in Google Scholar, or you're using a search engine, whatever search engine you're using, it will bring up other related studies. And it'll often give you a citation search at the same time. So you've got then all of those studies to draw on. And then author searching as well, just for one particular author maybe. So synthesis strategies then, I'm not going to go into this now in any detail, but when you synthesize in qualitative research, what makes it different from a narrative review is you subject it to a stringent methodology. So some students get mixed up and they say that they're doing a qualitative literature review when they're actually doing a narrative review. And what makes it different is that you will subject your data to a synthesis strategy. So I've just chosen grounded theory. Well, what grounded theory does is it starts from a kind of a grassroots investigation. You don't know what it is you're going to search for. You've got a rough hunch, but you're kind of going on a journey, starting from the ground up. And the theory emerges, and then you use different methods of constant comparison until you've reached theoretical saturation. So in other words, you keep searching until there's nothing new. So you know in qualitative research, when you've done a good job, when you've reached theoretical saturation, every article you come across, there is absolutely nothing new whatsoever in it. And you go over and you do it cycle by cycle, and you also code all of your data. Now, grounded theory is brilliant in that it has created a massive complex set of codes. You can go on grounded theory weekends to learn how to do it if you really want to, but you can subject your data to the same process. So rather than just writing about it in lovely themes and having a jolly good time, you're much more rigorous about it, and you apply systemized codes to each and every research study that you've chosen to include in your study. Does that make, in your literature review, does that make sense? So that's what we call a synthesis strategy. So a qualitative literature review deals with these different strategies that are about organizing your data in a much more creative, less systemized way, but there is system to it nonetheless. So I don't think they're any less difficult really than the other type. Textual narrative synthesis is when you organize your studies into homogeneous groups, and then you subject it again to exactly the same process. So you look at the quality, its findings, and you basically go through using a standard format. So for every study, you analyze each and every study going systematically through a particular format. So these are just 26 different synthesis methods that you can use in a qualitative literature review. So that is part of its challenge, learning how to use some of these synthesis methods, and is something that I'm hoping to come back to as I progress through my journey. So what does it mean for you? I realise I'm chucking quite a lot at you. It means that you can go and look at those resources, knowing that you can do it a little bit at a time. You don't have to do it all to begin with. So an integrative literature review, our last type of literature review, is basically where you mix up qualitative and quantitative research together. Now, again, students will often go, I'm doing a mixed methods review, because they've got qualitative studies and quantitative studies. You're not doing an integrative mixed methods review at all, unless you use a synthesis process and a quantitative calculation process. You have to use both in order, or at least one that covers both, in order for it to be a proper integrated literature review. And so that's the difference. With a narrative review, there's no methodology. Within all of these other ones that I've talked you through, you're drawing on a particular methodology, even if you're not applying it as thoroughly as you perhaps could do. So these ones are the most, they're extremely challenging, and they require a team of experts. So probably we're looking at something that's much more advanced. So then if the narrative review has been slated as it's not being rigorous enough, then what place does it have within academia? But it does have a place. and Sandalowski and Barroso say that it actually is the most common form of literature review that precedes either proposal or report. And as I said to you, in the voice and speech review, it is the most common review that you will see. And the purpose is to highlight gaps, make a case, and make a case perhaps for primary research study. So it does still have its place. And the other thing is, I think it's a brilliant training ground, because you can use this to build up your methodological knowledge slowly and explore as you go. You can use it as a springboard for a theoretical paper, so you can get more artistic with it if you wish. So it still allows for creativity. So for me, I think this is a really good way to go, to know that you're standing here, but use it as a way in which to cherry pick and build your methodological knowledge. So to summarize, we've got a narrative review with no rules. It's creative, it's experimental. This is where you might sit, this is where you might stay. You may well add in templates and frameworks to make it more rigorous. You can do that and still remain within the narrative review. Or you can flirt and play around with some meta-analysis and some metasynthesis. You can have a look at those studies in a scoping review and see if that appeals. Or you can start to explore the qualitative synthesis techniques, playing around with grounded theory, maybe hermeneutics. There's lots of them that you may appeal to you. I'll probably leave that one well alone for now, because that's the mixed methods one. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. How have I done for time? Bang on an hour. I've thrown so much at you. This was my streamlined version. I'm going to just stop the share and have a look at you. How many have I lost? Any questions? Did that make sense, or did I throw far too much? This is my streamlined version. I noticed Jono was on here when I did my less streamlined version. Is he gone? Have I driven him off? No, maybe I imagined him. Any questions? Oh, I'm glad you've learned a lot. That's good. I'm so conscious when I'm throwing so much at you, have I overdone it? So the first time I ran this, it was disaster. I just piled in the kitchen sink. And afterwards I thought, oh God, that was dreadful. Fantastic, thank you. A lot of words to look up though. But again, know that it's complicated, but don't let it freak you out. You can do it slowly. Oh, thank you, Christina. I did slightly panic to find Christina Shaw was on.
Could I just ask a question, Debbie?
Yeah, you can.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that. Thanks very much. You're so engaging and so knowledgeable. It was an hour of just obviously going through lots of things that I did almost 2 years ago. But really interesting. I'm very involved at the moment in London in what's called LTNs, low traffic neighbourhoods, and I've become really interested in analysis and what local authorities use as their data. And I've discovered this abhorrence people have of being quoted figures and data and numbers. The reality is, of course, most of our policy in our everyday lives must be done on figures and data and numbers. But I'm very interested in the way how the local authority have presented it, because a lot of people really hate being quoted numbers and data. So I suppose my question is about finding that balance between qualitative and quantitative and how it's presented, and the linguistic importance of how it's presented. And I think this could apply absolutely to our health service in every way, and I can see why it is. But I'm very interested in how to get funding for a proposal that somehow uses robust numbers and figures, but at the same time doesn't distance its audience if that's the audience you're looking to engage.
Yeah, so I think a metasynthesis would be really good for you then, because you're still within that quantitative paradigm, so you've still got rigor. I think what kind of data are you using? Are you using using grey data? Are you using unofficial kind of documents?
No. This is the data I'm referring to is done by peer-reviewed research.
Okay. Yeah.
So it's high quality, robust research, but it's essentially, I mean, it is qualitative, of course. It's a lot of things are summarised, and when I read the research, but essentially the primary, the raw data, the grey data, is based on numbers.
Yeah.
Counting cars, counting people, counting cyclists, looking at other research and that's gone before. But a lot of it is grey data, and people, general public, hate it.
Yeah, they do hate it, but equally, if what are you trying to get with it? You're trying to get some funding with it. So I would say it's worth going down. I would personally write. So if I was asked to do that, then I might well just go, actually, I can't keep part-arting around with all this philosophical stuff, which is what I really like doing. And I would probably go for a metasynthesis approach where I would probably use a rig. So when you're writing your report, if it's a proposal, make sure your methodology is clear. Because what you do when you do that is I've just spotted a really cute dog there, Sam Yucta's dog, so cute. Sorry, distracted by a dog. What you do there is you're setting up, you're commanding. What a methodology does is it gives a sense of command, that this is a rigorous report. Yeah, so have a look at what might be an idea is to have a look at how different metasyntheses are done. So if you look on Cochrane, you'll probably be able to draw on a few of them and have a look. You're welcome. Any other questions?
I have a question. Sorry for the noise, I'm outside. So would you say then that most narrative reviews end up containing most of the same stuff that the more structured reviews would have, but just presented differently? Or would you say that they end up with very different information within them?
I think it depends on who's done them and how exhaustive the research was. So I think I think particularly maybe in the voice of speech review, where you've got a huge divergence perhaps of different studies and different ability levels as well. You've got more diversity. So I think it depends on who's done them and how good they are at research. Because not everybody is as thorough in their actual research as perhaps they could be, and how long they take to do it. But also sometimes I think, for me, I think narrative reviews can be really interesting because for me, they bridge that gap between a literature review and a theoretical paper. And so in my own paper that I've just written, I haven't got a methodology in it. And so I've had a complete meltdown. It's like, well, I'm handling literature. So what the hell am I doing? And I was saying to my supervisors, I'm actually doing a literature review. And they were laughing and they were going, no, you're doing a theoretical paper. But then that's just made me think, well, what the hell is a theoretical paper? And why is that different to a narrative review? And I think it is different because in a theoretical paper, you're kind of putting forward arguments and your bias is probably a lot more obvious and a lot more transparent, but it's damn sight more interesting to read. So I think they're more diverse. And I think particularly in the arts, I think you've got a lot more diversity and creativity.
So you would say that the narrative reviews generally have a better readability than some of the more structured reviews?
Yes.
Yeah.
Probably, not necessarily, but I suppose they're more, I guess systematic reviews can be a bit dull. They're all the same. And they're all, it depends on whether they take a descriptive approach to analysing the data or whether they're more interpretive, would depend on whether or not the level of excitement you feel when you read one. So I think there's a place for the narrative. I feel quite protective of the narrative review, and I'd hate to see it go, because ultimately, if we can't break rules, if we've got nowhere to have outlandish commentary, like Hammersley, I mean, he's an amazing academic, but he's outrageous in some of the stuff that he says, but it's really great thinking. We've got to have somewhere for that. And if we don't, we lose that. That would be such a pity. Anybody else?
Just me, Debbie. So if one was going to be mercenary about a piece of research, and given my interest in health and Singing for Health, you were saying that the scoping review is more is looked upon more favourably. So would you suggest that would be a place to start to explore one's development?
Yes, I think for you, because you're in Singing for Health, and ultimately you want funding for your project, and so you've got to talk the language.
Right. Okay.
Language that they're going to receive. And so if you start to use the words of a scoping review, you maybe say, I'm drawn on the methodology of Peters et al. You know, they're going to say, oh, okay, this is quite a good piece of work. I'm going to sit and read this. They're not going to dismiss it out of hand. Because ultimately, they haven't got time to go and do the research that you're about to put to them. So you've just got to convince them that you're going to do well enough to get the funding. So
Yeah.
I would say, yes, speak their language.
Okay.
So, and I guess maybe as we become different practitioners, we have to maybe be more flexible, don't we?
Yeah.
With trying to get some funding.
Yeah. Yeah. Lovely. Thank you. I loved it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Do you wish I'd done that a few years ago?
Yes. Yes.
Saves a lot of heartache.
Well, it's all secular, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Anybody else? Any other questions? No. Great. Well, in that case, I'll say goodbye. See you later. Oh, thank you, Olivia.